How do you kill a god? Not just one, but an entire pantheon that had ruled the heavens for 1,000 years. Jupiter, the king of the gods, whose thunderbolts guaranteed Roman victory. Mars, the god of war, who forged an empire that stretched from the sands of Syria to the misty shores of Britain. Apollo, Venus, Neptune, these weren't just characters in myths. For the Romans, they were real, active forces in the universe. They were the divine guarantors of the most powerful civilization the world had ever known. The deal was simple. Rome paid its dues in sacrifice and ritual, and the gods delivered prosperity and military dominance. The system worked, and then it stopped. In the span of a single human lifetime, these immortal beings vanished. Not faded away, but were systematically dismantled, outlawed, and erased by the very empire they had built. Their temples were shattered, their priestesses silenced, their ancient rites declared a capital crime. What could possibly have the power to overthrow the gods of the conquerors? The answer is the single greatest mystery of the ancient world. It wasn't a rival empire or a new philosophy. It was a small, bewilderingly stubborn cult from a forgotten corner of the empire. A faith whose central figure was a carpenter from Galilee, executed by the Roman state itself. How did a religion that began with 12 followers in a dusty province conquer the spiritual heart of an empire of 60 million? This isn't just a story of faith. It's the story of the most successful religious hostile takeover in history. And to understand it, we first have to understand the world the Roman gods actually lived in. Forget everything you think you know about ancient religion. The Roman spiritual landscape wasn't a monolithic church. It was a chaotic, sprawling, open-air market of belief. Imagine walking through ancient Rome. On one corner, you see a grand temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the heart of the state religion. Senators in white togas offer solemn prayers for the welfare of the emperor. But walk a block further, and you stumble into a dark underground chamber where men are being initiated into the Persian mystery cult of Mithras, slaying a symbolic bull in a secret ceremony. Cross the river, and you find a vibrant temple to the Egyptian goddess Isis, her followers chanting and rattling sistrums, promising a blissful afterlife to their devotees. This was the norm. The Romans were collectors of gods. When they conquered a new people, they didn't stamp out their deities, they absorbed them. They saw the gods of the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Celts, and said, "Your god of war? He's just another name for our Mars. Your goddess of wisdom? That's our Minerva." This practice, called syncretism, was Rome's spiritual genius. It was inclusive, flexible, and politically brilliant. It turned potential religious conflict into a tool of assimilation. You could worship your ancestral gods in Britain and still be a good Roman citizen, as long as you also paid respect to the gods of Rome. It was an all-of-the-above approach to the divine. At the very core of this system was a contract, a sacred agreement known as the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. The logic was brutally simple. If Rome honored the gods with the correct rituals, festivals, and sacrifices, the gods would, in turn, bless Rome with stability, military victory, and prosperity. It was transactional. Religion wasn't about personal salvation or moral philosophy. It was a matter of public infrastructure, as vital as roads and aqueducts. If an army lost a battle, the first question wasn't about failed strategy, but which god did we offend? Which ritual was performed incorrectly? The Vestal Virgins, priestesses who tended the sacred flame of Rome, were more important to national security than a legion of soldiers. If that flame went out, it was a terrifying omen that the gods had abandoned them. The entire empire ran on this delicate balance of divine favor. Into this vibrant, flexible, and deeply pragmatic world, Christianity arrived. And at first no one really noticed. To the average Roman, these Christians were just another strange, slightly morbid sect from the East. They were lumped in with dozens of other mystery cults flooding into the capital. They were secretive, they met in private homes, and they talked about a founder who had been crucified, the most shameful and degrading form of execution reserved for slaves and rebels. They were, in a word, weird. But in a city full of weird cults, they didn't initially stand out. But there was one critical difference. A difference so profound it would eventually shatter the Roman world. Every other religion in the empire operated on the principle of addition. You could worship Mithras and Jupiter. You could honor Isis and the emperor. Christianity operated on the principle of subtraction. It made a claim that was, to the Roman mind, both insane and deeply offensive. It claimed that all other gods were false. Not just inferior but non-existent demons. There was only one God, and to worship any other was a betrayal. This wasn't just a theological disagreement. This was treason. By refusing to offer a pinch of incense to the image of the emperor or a small sacrifice to Jupiter, the Christians weren't just being stubborn, they were tearing up the Pax Deorum. They were breaking the sacred contract that kept the universe in balance and the empire safe. In the eyes of the state, these Christians were atheists, not because they didn't believe in a god, but because they rejected all the important ones, the ones who actually ran the world. Their exclusivity was seen as a direct threat to the security of the Roman state. They were cosmic saboteurs, inviting divine wrath upon everyone. This fundamental conflict finally exploded into the public consciousness in the year 64 AD. A catastrophic fire swept through Rome, raging for 6 days and leveling huge swathes of the city. The populace was devastated, angry, and looking for someone to blame. The Emperor Nero, a man known for his cruelty and instability, found the perfect scapegoat, that strange antisocial cult that hated all the gods. The historian Tacitus, a Roman who had no love for Christians, described what happened next. Nero rounded them up. Some were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena for public entertainment. Others, Tacitus wrote, were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as torches by night. Nero had lit his gardens with the burning bodies of Christians. This was the first major state-sponsored persecution. It was localized to the city of Rome, a brutal, sadistic lashing out by a paranoid emperor. It was designed to be an extermination. It should have been the end of this tiny, misunderstood faith. But it wasn't. It was the beginning, because in that horrific display of imperial power, Nero accidentally gave the Christian movement its most powerful weapon, the martyr. He thought he was destroying a religion. Instead, he was forging its identity in fire, creating a story of suffering and redemption that would echo through the centuries, and proving that this new faith was something the Romans had never encountered before. A belief that people were not just willing to live by, but to die for. The question was no longer if Rome could tolerate this new god, but whether it could survive him. To the Romans, this was madness. Utter, incomprehensible madness. Their entire world was built on a foundation of tangible power, of honor in this life, of legacy carved in stone and conquest. You lived for Rome. You fought for Rome. And if you died for the glory of the empire, hoping to be remembered in stories and statues. But these Christians, they were dying for a ghost. For a carpenter from a backwater province, executed as a common criminal. They walked into the arenas not with curses on their lips, but with hymns. They looked at the lions, at the gladiators, at the roaring crowds, and they saw a doorway to a better place. This wasn't just bravery. It was a fundamental rejection of everything a Roman held dear. It was like watching someone willingly set fire to a winning lottery ticket. The Roman mind simply couldn't process it, because to understand their shock, you have to understand their gods. The Roman pantheon, Jupiter, Mars, Juno, Venus, they weren't gods of love and mercy. They were cosmic politicians. They were supernatural extensions of the state itself. Power, order, and transaction. That was the language they spoke. You didn't pray to Jupiter because you loved him. You prayed to Jupiter because he was the king of the gods and you needed a favor. You performed a sacrifice, you said the right words, and you hoped the mighty god of sky and thunder would hold up his end of the bargain. It was a contract. I give you this bull, you give my legion victory. I burn this incense, you ensure my child is born healthy. The gods were patrons and the people were their clients. They were powerful, they were terrifying, and they were profoundly distant. They didn't care about your inner life, your moral struggles, or your fear of death. They cared about the proper rituals being observed. They were there to ensure the prosperity and stability of Rome, the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. As long as the sacrifices were made and the temples were maintained, the gods would protect the empire. It was a public utility, not a personal relationship. For the average person living in a crowded Roman tenement, life was hard, often brutal and short. What comfort could Jupiter, feasting on ambrosia on Mount Olympus, offer a slave being whipped in a quarry? What hope could Venus, goddess of beauty, offer a mother who had just lost her third child to fever? The Roman gods had no answer for suffering. Their answer was essentially, that's life. Make a sacrifice and hope for better luck. And when you died, oblivion. a gray, shadowy underworld for most, with no real hope or promise. Your legacy was what you left behind in the world of the living. For the 99% of the population, that meant being forgotten entirely. Into this world of cosmic indifference and spiritual emptiness, Christianity arrived. And it wasn't just a new god to add to the collection. Rome had hundreds of gods. It was a fundamentally different kind of belief. It was a revolution in thought. First, it offered a personal relationship with the creator of the universe. This wasn't a distant, transactional deity. This was a god who knew your name. A god who cared about your struggles, your pain, your hopes. A god who was not a distant king, but a loving father. This concept alone was earth-shattering. For the slave, the soldier, the shopkeeper, the idea that the ultimate power in the cosmos was intimately concerned with their individual life was a revelation. Second, it offered an answer to suffering. The Roman gods were powerful and perfect, living in eternal bliss. They couldn't possibly understand human pain, but the Christian God had become human. He had lived a life of poverty. He had been betrayed by his friends. He had been tortured and executed by the Roman state itself. This was the masterstroke. The Christian God didn't just rule from on high. He had suffered with them. His symbol wasn't a thunderbolt of power, but a cross, an instrument of brutal Roman execution. It transformed suffering from a meaningless curse into something that could have redemptive power, something that God himself understood. And third, perhaps most powerfully, it offered hope. It offered a concrete, detailed, and glorious afterlife. It didn't just whisper about a shadowy underworld. It promised paradise. It promised a reunion with loved ones. It promised a place where there was no more suffering, no more injustice, no more death. And the price of admission wasn't expensive sacrifices or loyalty to the emperor. It was faith. It was belief. This promise completely rewired the human brain. Suddenly, death wasn't the end. It was the beginning. This life, with all its misery and injustice, was just a brief, temporary trial. The real prize lay beyond. Now, think about what that does to a person. If you truly believe that, why would you fear the lion in the Colosseum? Why would you fear the executioner's sword? They weren't taking your life. They were delivering your reward. This is why the martyrs smiled. They saw the finish line. But the appeal went even deeper. It wasn't just a spiritual revolution. It was a social one. Roman society was a brutal pyramid. At the top, the emperor and the senatorial elite. At the bottom, millions of slaves treated as property. Women were second-class citizens. The poor and the sick were often left to die in the streets. Christianity took a sledgehammer to that pyramid. It declared that in the eyes of God, all were equal. The soul of a slave was just as precious as the soul of the emperor. The soul of a woman was just as valuable as the soul of a man. This was dangerously subversive. It gave inherent dignity and worth to the very people the Roman system was built to exploit. And they didn't just preach it. They lived it. The early Christian communities were radical islands of compassion in a sea of cruelty. They shared their possessions. They cared for their widows and orphans. When plagues swept through Roman cities and the wealthy fled to their country villas, leaving the sick to rot, the Christians stayed. They cared for their own sick, and they cared for pagans sick too. They offered food and water and comfort to the dying, regardless of who they were. A Roman watching this would be stunned. Why would you risk your life for a stranger? For an enemy? The answer was simple. Because their God had commanded them to love their neighbor as themselves. This was charity on a scale the world had never seen. Being a Christian meant you were part of a family. A community that would literally catch you when you fell. In a world with no social safety net, the church was the safety net. This was a tangible, life-saving benefit. It's easy to see the appeal. Do you join the cult of Mars, which demands a sacrifice and offers nothing if you get sick? Or do you join the cult of Christ, which offers you food, medicine, community, and the promise of eternal life? For millions, the choice was obvious. This new faith was spreading not through the sword, but through acts of kindness. It was a grassroots movement, passed from neighbor to neighbor, from slave to master, from wife to husband. It wasn't being imposed from the top down by the powerful. It was bubbling up from the bottom, from the forgotten, the marginalized, and the poor. It was an insurgency of hope, and the Roman authorities were beginning to notice. They were realizing that this wasn't just another strange, foreign cult. This was a direct challenge to the Roman way of life, to the power of the emperor, and to the authority of the gods themselves. This wasn't a religion you could simply add to the pantheon. It was a religion that claimed all other gods were false. And in a world held together by the peace of the gods, that was not just heresy, it was treason. The quiet whispers of faith were about to be met with the roar of the empire. And that roar first echoed through the smoke-choked streets of Rome in the year 64 AD. It began not with a decree but with a spark. A fire, starting in the merchant shops around the Circus Maximus, quickly became an inferno. For 6 days and 7 nights it devoured the city. When the embers finally cooled, 2/3 of the greatest city on earth was a wasteland of ash and rubble. The people, homeless and grieving, needed someone to blame. And their whispers soon turned to their emperor, Nero. Rumors swirled that Nero himself had started the fire to clear land for a lavish new palace. They said he'd stood on his balcony and played his lyre as his city burned, a poet celebrating his own destructive masterpiece. Whether true or not, the story stuck. Nero, a man who lived and died by public opinion, was in a political death spiral. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed one fast. He found them in a small, misunderstood sect that was already the subject of sinister gossip, a group known as the Christians. To the average Roman, these people were bizarre. They were secretive, meeting in homes and catacombs before dawn or after dusk. They refused to participate in the public festivals that were the lifeblood of Roman society. They wouldn't buy meat sacrificed to the gods, wouldn't burn a pinch of incense for the emperor's genius. They were outsiders by choice. And where there is secrecy, suspicion breeds monsters. The Romans, hearing snippets of Christian ritual, filled in the blanks with their darkest imaginations. Christians spoke of eating the flesh and drinking the blood of their Savior. The Romans heard cannibalism. They called each other brother and sister and greeted one another with a holy kiss. The Romans heard incest. They worshipped an invisible god and denied the entire Roman pantheon. The Romans heard atheism, and this last charge, atheism, was the most dangerous of all. To a Roman, denying the gods was like cutting the power lines to the city. The Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, was a sacred contract. The Romans honored the gods with rituals and sacrifices, and in return, the gods granted the empire victory, prosperity, and stability. These Christians, with their stubborn refusal to honor the gods, weren't just practicing a different religion. They were actively endangering the entire state. They were inviting divine wrath. They were committing cosmic treason. So when Nero pointed his finger, the Roman people were ready to believe it. The historian Tacitus, no friend to Nero or the Christians, tells us what happened next. First, known members of the sect were arrested. Under torture, they named others. Soon, a vast multitude was condemned, and their punishment was designed not just to kill but to horrify, to make a public spectacle of their supposed depravity. Some were crucified. Others were covered in animal skins and torn apart by wild dogs in the arena for the entertainment of the crowds. But the most infamous punishment was reserved for the night. Christians were tied to stakes in Nero's gardens, coated in pitch and tar, and set ablaze. They became human torches, their burning bodies illuminating the emperor's private parties. Nero, Tacitus tells us, even drove his chariot among the crowds, enjoying the grotesque spectacle. The goal was simple: to annihilate this movement, to terrify anyone who might even consider joining it, to burn the memory of this faith out of the Roman mind. It was the first time the full terrifying power of the Roman state was brought to bear against the followers of Christ, and by all logic it should have worked. A tiny, powerless sect against the might of an empire that had conquered the known world. It was no contest, but something strange happened, something the Romans, with all their pragmatism and power, could not comprehend. As the flames rose in Nero's garden, a new idea was being forged in the minds of those who watched. The Roman concept of a noble death was well established. A soldier dying for the legion, a philosopher drinking hemlock for his principles. But this was different. These weren't soldiers or senators. They were slaves, merchants, women, common people. And they were dying not with curses on their lips, but with prayers, with hymns. Some accounts say they went to their deaths with a strange, unnerving serenity, convinced they were heading to a better place. The Roman public, initially baying for blood, began to feel a sense of unease. Tacitus himself notes that a feeling of compassion arose for the victims. Yes, they were guilty and deserved punishment, he thought, But their extermination seemed to be less about public justice and more about satisfying the cruelty of one man. The spectacle was so grotesque, so over the top, that it started to backfire. Instead of proving the Christians were monstrous, the persecution highlighted the monstrosity of the emperor. And instead of crushing the faith, it created a new kind of hero, the martyr. The word martyr literally means witness, and their deaths were the most powerful witness statement imaginable. Their blood, as the church father Tertullian would later write, became the seed of the church. For the surviving Christians, these deaths were not defeats. They were victories. The martyrs were seen as spiritual athletes who had won the ultimate prize. Their stories were collected and shared, whispered from one secret gathering to another. The graves of the martyrs became holy sites. The day of their death was celebrated as their birthday into heaven. This was a complete inversion of Roman values. The Romans celebrated power, victory, and life. This new faith was finding strength in weakness, victory in death, and eternal life in execution. Nero's persecution set a terrifying precedent. For the next 2.5 centuries, being a Christian in the Roman Empire was at times a capital offense. The persecutions would ebb and flow. Some emperors ignored the Christians. Others, like Decius or Valerian, would launch empire-wide campaigns to force them to sacrifice to the gods or die. They were seen as a persistent infection within the body of the empire, a threat that had to be managed, suppressed, and, if possible, surgically removed. The Roman state threw everything it had at them: the threat of arrest, the seizure of property, torture, the horror of the arena, public execution, the full weight of the law and the sword. And yet the faith grew. It spread not through conquest but through conversation, not in temples but in homes. It moved along trade routes, carried by merchants and slaves. It took root in the barracks among soldiers and even in the households of the aristocracy. This presented the Romans with a terrifying paradox. How do you defeat an enemy that doesn't fear death? How do you suppress a movement that grows stronger every time you strike it? The Roman toolkit, brute force, legal authority, public shame, was failing. They were trying to solve a spiritual problem with political and military solutions, and it wasn't working. Every execution was a public advertisement for the faith's power. Every martyr was a recruiting poster. The empire had successfully crushed countless rebellions and conquered powerful kingdoms. But now it was facing a new kind of enemy. An enemy that fought not with swords but with ideas. An enemy whose greatest weapon was its own willingness to die. The quiet whispers of faith had been met with the roar of the empire, and somehow the whispers were getting louder. The question was no longer if the empire could destroy Christianity, but what this resilient new faith was about to do to the empire itself. The Tetrarchy, Diocletian's grand design of 4 emperors ruling a divided empire, was meant to be a fortress against chaos. A system of interlocking power of senior and junior emperors, designed to ensure a smooth transition and prevent the bloody civil wars that had nearly torn Rome apart for a century. But the fortress had a fatal flaw. It was built with human ambition, and the mortar was starting to crack. In the year 305, Diocletian did the unthinkable. He voluntarily retired, forcing his co-emperor Maximian to do the same. The system was meant to click forward, with the junior emperors becoming senior, and new juniors being appointed. It was supposed to be orderly. It was anything but. In the wings, a young man named Constantine was watching. He wasn't just anyone. He was the son of Constantius, the junior emperor of the West. But Constantine was far from his father's side. He was a virtual hostage, kept close in the Eastern court by the senior emperor, Diocletian, and his successor, Galerius. He was a living piece of collateral, a guarantee of his father's loyalty. But Constantine was more than a pawn. He was brilliant, charismatic, and a fearsome military commander. He saw the system his father served was a house of cards, and he knew that when it fell, you either seized power or you were crushed by it. As his father's health began to fail across the empire in Britain, Constantine knew his time as a gilded captive was running out. His rivals in the East would never let him claim his father's throne. He would be a threat to be eliminated. So he did what all great figures in history do. He took a monumental gamble. One night, he fled the Eastern court, riding hard across the continent, allegedly hamstringing the fresh horses at each post station behind him to prevent pursuit. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing race across the Roman world to reach his dying father's side. He made it, just in time. In 306, in the Roman city of Eboracum, what we now call York in England, his father died. And right there, on the misty edge of the known world, his father's legions did something that shattered the Tetrarchy's fragile rules. They ignored the official successors and hailed Constantine as Augustus, as full emperor. The first crack in the system had become a chasm, and across the empire, other ambitious men saw their chance. In Rome itself, Maxentius, the son of the retired Emperor Maximian, staged a coup, declared himself emperor, and took control of Italy and North Africa. The great experiment was over. The civil wars were back. What followed was a brutal 6-year free-for-all. Emperors and would-be emperors rose and fell, forging alliances, betraying each other, and bleeding the empire dry. Constantine consolidated his power in Britain and Gaul, proving himself an exceptional general. He was a traditional Roman in many ways. He minted coins with the sun god, Sol Invictus, his chosen patron deity. He was the kind of strongman Rome understood. But he was facing a rival in Maxentius who held the ultimate prize, the city of Rome itself. Maxentius had a larger army, the backing of the elite Praetorian Guard, and the immense defensive advantage of the city's ancient, formidable walls. In 312, Constantine did something that every military advisor would have called insane. He gathered his army, a force significantly smaller than his enemies, and marched over the Alps into Italy. He was leaving his own territory undefended, risking everything on a single decisive campaign. He won victory after victory on his march down the Italian peninsula, but he knew the real test was Rome. Maxentius was waiting for him, and everyone expected Constantine to get bogged down in a long, costly siege he couldn't possibly win. But then something happened, something that would not only decide the battle, but would pivot the entire course of Western civilization. The night before the final confrontation, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine, the worshipper of the unconquered sun, looked to the heavens for a sign. Later accounts, one from the Christian scholar Lactantius and another from the bishop Eusebius, who claimed to have heard it from the emperor himself, tell a story that defies simple explanation. As the sun was beginning to set, Constantine saw a vision. A cross of light superimposed over the sun, and with it, the Greek words Nu Tau Omicron Tau Nu Capi Alpha. In this sign conquer. That night, he dreamt that he was commanded to create a new standard for his army. Not the traditional Roman eagle, but a standard bearing the symbol he had seen. The Chi, the first 2 Greek letters of Christ's name. Imagine the scene. A Roman general, a pagan, on the verge of the most important battle of his life. His entire future, the fate of the empire, hangs in the balance. And his response is not to sacrifice to Jupiter, not to consult the augurs, not to pray to Mars, the god of war. His response is to order his soldiers, the vast majority of them pagans themselves, to paint a strange, new symbol on their shields. The symbol of a tiny, persecuted, and often despised religious minority. Was it a genuine miracle? A divinely inspired moment that changed history? Or was it a stroke of psychological genius? A calculated political move by a man who saw that the old gods were failing, and that this resilient Christian faith had a power he could harness? Perhaps he saw the conviction of the Christians he knew, their willingness to die for their faith, and thought, that is the kind of power I want in my soldiers. We will never know for certain what happened in his mind, but what we do know is what happened next. Maxentius, in a shocking turn of events, did the one thing Constantine needed him to do. He abandoned the safety of Rome's walls and marched his larger army out to meet Constantine's forces in open battle. Why? The historians say the Roman citizens were taunting him as a coward, and that a series of omens had been interpreted in his favor. So he crossed the Tiber River over a rickety pontoon bridge known as the Milvian Bridge, and arrayed his army for a fight. The battle was fierce, but Constantine's smaller, battle-hardened army, fighting with a strange new fervor under their new symbol, began to push Maxentius's forces back. The retreat turned into a rout. The terrified soldiers of Maxentius scrambled to get back across the river, but the makeshift bridge, overloaded with the weight of panicked men in heavy armor, collapsed. Thousands drowned in the swirling currents of the Tiber. Among them was Maxentius himself, weighed down by his own armor, his body found in the mud the next day. Constantine had won. Against all odds, he was the undisputed master of the Western Roman Empire. The next day he marched into Rome in triumph. But this was a triumph unlike any other. He did not go to the Capitoline Hill to give thanks at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the traditional ritual for a victorious general. The city waited, but he never went. Instead, the head of his vanquished rival was paraded through the streets on a spear, and Constantine declared that the liberation of Rome was owed not to the old gods, but to the power of the Christian God. The symbol from his vision, the Chiro, was soon placed on the Roman standards. Shortly after, in 313, Constantine met with Licinius, the emperor of the East, and together they issued the Edict of Milan. This wasn't a decree that made Christianity the state religion, not yet. It was something almost more revolutionary. It declared official religious tolerance throughout the Roman Empire. For the first time in 3 centuries, it was no longer a crime to be a Christian. The persecutions were over. The Great Persecution of Diocletian, which had sought to wipe Christianity from the face of the earth, had ended in utter failure just a few years earlier. Now, the man who sat on the throne of the Caesars was openly attributing his power to the very God whose followers Diocletian had tried to destroy. The whispers had not only grown louder, they now echoed from the imperial palace itself. The relationship between the cross and the sword had been forever transformed. A faith built on the promise of a kingdom not of this world, now had an emperor as its champion. And no one, not the Christians, not the pagans, and certainly not Constantine himself, could possibly imagine what would happen next. The Roman world held its breath. A revolution had occurred not on a battlefield, but in the mind of one man. And that man now controlled everything. For the pagan elite, the senators and priests who traced their lineage back to the Republic, this was a moment of profound disorientation. Their emperor, the living embodiment of Roman power, the Pontifex Maximus or chief priest of their gods, was now openly favoring a bizarre, once illegal cult from the East. It was unthinkable. It was as if a president today suddenly declared his allegiance to a fringe group the government had been actively suppressing just years earlier. The ground beneath their feet had shifted. For the Christians it was a miracle but a terrifying one. For 3 centuries their relationship with the state was simple. They were the nail, the state was the hammer. Now the hammer was offering to build them a cathedral. They had prayed for deliverance, but no one had ever imagined deliverance would look like this. The Emperor of Rome, the successor to Nero and Diocletian, was one of them. What did that even mean? The rules of the game had not just changed, the entire game had been thrown out. Constantine, for his part, was a master politician playing the most dangerous game of his life. He hadn't won the empire just to tear it apart. He ruled over a population that was still overwhelmingly pagan. The army, the Senate, the entire administrative structure of Rome was built on the foundation of the old gods. To simply outlaw Jupiter would be suicide. So he began a delicate, brilliant, and sometimes contradictory balancing act. He ended the persecutions, restored confiscated church property, and granted Christian clergy the same tax exemptions that pagan priests had always enjoyed. These were monumental steps. But at the same time he was careful. For years, his coin still bore the images of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a deity he could frame in a way that was acceptable to both pagans and many Christians, who saw Christ as the true sun. He retained the title of Pontifex Maximus his entire life, remaining the official head of the state pagan cult. He was, in essence, trying to be the CEO of 2 rival corporations at the same time. He funded the construction of glorious new churches in Jerusalem and Rome, but he also permitted the construction of new pagan temples in other parts of the empire. He wasn't just hedging his bets. He was trying to stitch together a new Roman identity, one where the cross could, perhaps, stand alongside the eagle. But power, like water, always finds its own level. And Constantine's imperial favor opened the floodgates. Suddenly, being a Christian wasn't just safe, it was advantageous. Bishops, who a decade earlier were hiding in catacombs, were now summoned to the imperial court. They rode on the imperial postal system, ate at the emperor's table, and became his trusted advisors. Ambitious young men across the empire saw which way the wind was blowing. A career in the church was no longer a path to martyrdom. It was a path to influence, wealth, and power. The state's money, which had once funded lavish festivals for Mars and Venus, now began to pour into the construction of breathtaking basilicas, vast churches designed to overwhelm the senses and display the power of this new favored faith. This shift created a new kind of social friction. The old pagan aristocracy watched in horror as these upstart bishops, many from humble backgrounds, began to wield enormous influence. They saw the traditions that had guided Rome for 1,000 years being pushed aside. To them, Christianity was not just a different religion, it was fundamentally anti-Roman. Roman religion was about public duty, civic ritual, and transactional relationships with the gods to ensure the prosperity of the state, the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. Christianity was about personal salvation, a private relationship with a single deity, and a kingdom that was explicitly not of this world. How could you run an empire, they argued, with a religion that seemed to devalue the empire itself? But as the old gods began their slow, forced retirement, a new and far more immediate problem erupted. It came not from the pagans, but from within the church itself. Now that Christians were no longer united by persecution, they had the luxury of arguing. And they argued with a ferocity that threatened to tear the church and the empire apart. The central conflict was a theological debate so profound it's almost hard for us to grasp today. It centered on a priest from Alexandria named Arius. Arius taught what seemed to him a logical truth. If God the Father created everything, then he must have also created his Son, Jesus. And if the Son was created, there must have been a time, however brief, when he did not exist. This meant that Jesus, while divine and worthy of worship, was subordinate to the Father, a lesser being. To his opponents, led by the fiery Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, this was blasphemy of the highest order. They argued that the Son was co-eternal with the Father, begotten not made, of the very same substance. To them, if Jesus was anything less than fully God, then his sacrifice on the cross was insufficient to save humanity. This wasn't just an academic squabble. It was a firestorm. Riots broke out in the streets of Alexandria and other major cities. Dock workers and merchants would get into fistfights arguing over the nature of the Trinity. The debate spread like a virus through the eastern half of the empire, splitting congregations, families, and cities. For Constantine, this was a political nightmare. He hadn't embraced Christianity to inherit a new set of civil wars. He famously wrote to the two factions, scolding them for fighting over small and trivial questions. He wanted unity. He demanded it. When his letters failed, he made a move that would forever fuse the power of the Roman state with the destiny of the Christian faith. In the year 325, he summoned every bishop in the empire to a grand council in the city of Nicaea. He paid their expenses, housed them in imperial buildings, and for the first time in history, the Roman emperor himself presided over a meeting of the Christian church. Imagine the scene. Over 300 bishops, men who had lived through the great persecution, many bearing the scars of torture, missing eyes, crippled limbs, branded skin, now sat in a lavish hall, treated as honored guests by the most powerful man in the world. They were there to debate theology, but Constantine was there to forge a weapon. He needed a single, unified, state-approved version of Christianity, a creed that could serve as the ideological glue for his empire. The result of their ferocious debates was the Nicene Creed, a document that millions of Christians still recite today. It sided decisively against Arius, declaring that the Son was of one being with the Father. The Council of Nicaea was a watershed moment. It was the first time an emperor had intervened to define Christian orthodoxy. Arius and his followers were condemned, their writings were ordered to be burned, and they were exiled, a civil punishment for a theological crime. A dangerous precedent had been set. The emperor was no longer just the protector of the church. He was now its arbiter and its enforcer. The lines had irrevocably blurred. The sword that had once been used to persecute Christians was now being offered to the church to persecute other Christians. And as the bishops left Nicaea, armed with an imperial creed, they were walking into a new world, one where faith and power were becoming the same thing, creating a force more potent and more perilous than anything Rome had ever seen. The Council of Nicaea was supposed to be an ending, a final definitive statement on the nature of God, hammered into place by the emperor himself. But it wasn't an ending. It was the firing of a starting pistol. The bishops who returned to their cities, creed in hand, didn't find a unified church waiting for them. They found a firestorm. The debates that had rocked the council chamber now spilled into the streets, the marketplaces, the homes of every Christian in the empire. The Arian controversy, the debate over whether Jesus was equal to God the Father or merely his first and greatest creation, didn't die at Nicaea. It exploded. For the next 50 years, the Roman world was plunged into a theological civil war. Bishops were exiled, then reinstated, then exiled again, depending on which emperor sat on the throne and which faction had his ear. Churches were seized by rival congregations. Riots broke out over the wording of a single Greek letter in the Creed. This wasn't some abstract intellectual exercise. This was about the very soul of their faith, and people were willing to fight and die for it. Constantine, who had craved unity above all else, had inadvertently shattered the church into a dozen warring pieces. And yet, even as his church tore itself apart, Constantine's own faith deepened, and his actions grew bolder. He had won his empire under the sign of the cross. Now, he would build a new capital in its image. He chose an ancient Greek city, Byzantium, strategically located between Europe and Asia. He renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and it was to be a new Rome, a Christian Rome. Unlike the ancient capital, groaning under the weight of its pagan temples and millennia of tradition, Constantinople was built for the new God. Churches, not temples, dominated its skyline. There was no grand Capitolium for Jupiter. Instead, the city's heart was the Church of the Holy Apostles. Constantine was sending a message to the world. The future of the Roman Empire was Christian, and its center of gravity was shifting away from the pagan past. He then began to cautiously, but deliberately, dismantle the machinery of the old faith. He wasn't banning it, not yet. He was cutting off its oxygen. Imperial funds that had once supported the ancient priesthoods and the upkeep of temples were diverted to the construction of new churches. He passed laws forbidding private divination, the practice of trying to see the future, which struck at the very heart of traditional Roman religion. Then, he authorized the destruction of a few, carefully selected pagan temples, particularly those associated with practices the Christians deemed immoral. For the first time in 1,000 years, Roman soldiers were given orders to tear down the houses of Roman gods. Imagine the shock, the sheer earth-shattering sacrilege of it all. This was more than a policy change. It was a psychological assault on the spiritual foundations of the empire. But Constantine still walked a fine line. He was one man, and the pagan traditions were ancient, powerful, and deeply embedded in the Roman aristocracy and military. He had to be careful. His sons would not be. When Constantine died in 337, the empire was divided between his three sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II. They had been raised in a world their father had created. They didn't remember a time when Christians were a persecuted minority. They had been tutored by Christian scholars. For them, Christianity wasn't a political convenience or a deathbed conversion. It was the one, absolute, unquestionable truth. And paganism wasn't just a misguided tradition of their ancestors. It was a demonic lie. It was darkness, and it needed to be extinguished. With the death of their father, the gloves came off. The cautious trimming of paganism turned into a full frontal assault. In 341, they issued a chilling edict that echoed across the empire. Let superstition cease. Let the madness of sacrifices be abolished. Think about what this meant. For centuries, the core public ritual of Roman life, the social and spiritual glue of every city, was animal sacrifice. It was how you honored the gods, secured their favor for the harvest, for the army, for the health of your family. Now the emperors themselves were calling it madness. To perform the rites of your ancestors was now a crime. This was followed by laws ordering the closing of all pagan temples. Some were to be shut, their doors barred, left to crumble into ruin. Others were to be seized and reconsecrated as churches. The state had officially declared war on its own gods. And this imperial decree unleashed something ferocious at the grassroots level. Zealous Christian mobs, sometimes led by their local bishops or fanatical monks, saw this as a green light. They took the law into their own hands. Across the empire, a wave of violent iconoclasm began. Gangs of Christians marched on ancient temples, armed with hammers and ropes in righteous fury. They smashed priceless statues that had stood for centuries, masterpieces of Greek and Roman art. They hacked the faces off the carved reliefs of gods and goddesses. They toppled sacred columns and set fire to holy shrines that had been places of pilgrimage for generations. This wasn't just random vandalism. It was a targeted, symbolic execution. Every beheaded statue of Aphrodite, every shattered altar to Jupiter, was a declaration of victory. It was a visceral demonstration to the local population that their gods were powerless. If Apollo could not protect his own image from a hammer, how could he possibly protect the city from a barbarian invasion? If Jupiter, the thunderer, the king of the gods, could not stop his own temple from being stripped bare, then he was no god at all. It was a brutal and terrifyingly effective form of psychological warfare. How did the pagans respond? They were stunned, horrified. The world had been turned upside down. The very definition of piety, pietas, the Roman duty to the gods, state, and family, was now being redefined as a crime. Many simply retreated, practicing the old rites in secret, in the privacy of their homes, whispering prayers they once shouted in public squares. They buried sacred objects to protect them from the mobs, hoping for a day when they could be unearthed. But others fought back. The intellectual elites, the senators, the philosophers, the aristocrats, launched a fierce counterattack in writing. They ridiculed Christian doctrines as illogical and absurd. They defended the ancient traditions as the source of Rome's greatness and stability. They argued that to abandon the gods who had made Rome the master of the world was an act of suicidal insanity. They saw the Christians not as enlightened, but as an uneducated, intolerant mob, dragging a sophisticated civilization back into darkness. It was a desperate, eloquent, and ultimately doomed resistance, because the Christians had something the pagans no longer did: the full coercive power of the state. Tax collectors, governors, and soldiers were now enforcing Christian orthodoxy, the very structure of the Roman Empire, once the ultimate protector of the pagan order, had been captured by this new faith and was being turned like a weapon against its creators. By the middle of the 4th century, the Roman world was fractured. The old gods were not dead, but they were in hiding, bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The new god sat on the imperial throne, his victory seeming more inevitable with each passing day. But the battle for the soul of Rome was not over. A deep resentment was simmering within the pagan aristocracy and the military. They were waiting, praying, hoping for a savior who could reverse the tide. And in one of the greatest ironies in history, that savior was about to emerge from within Constantine's own family, a man who would renounce the cross, embrace the gods of old, and launch one last, brilliant, desperate attempt to restore the pagan world. His name was Julian, and he was born in the shadow of the purple, the imperial color of Rome. He was the nephew of Constantine the Great, a prince of the new Christian dynasty. But for Julian, the cross was not a symbol of salvation. It was the symbol of the men who butchered his family. In the year 337 after Constantine's death, a bloody purge swept through the imperial household. Julian, just a boy of 6, was hidden away, but he would have heard the screams as his father, his older brother, and 6 of his cousins were systematically executed by the soldiers of his own Christian relatives, the sons of Constantine. This was his first lesson in Christian charity. He was spared only because of his youth, deemed no threat. He and his half-brother Gallus were exiled, raised far from the intrigues of the court, but under its constant paranoid surveillance, while his cousin, the Emperor Constantius II, ruled a Christian empire. Julian was raised on a diet of forced piety and secret rebellion. He was tutored by bishops, made to read scripture, and even ordained as a lector in the Christian church. Outwardly, he played the part of the devout Christian prince, but in secret, in the quiet solitude of his exile, Julian discovered another world. He devoured the ancient texts. He read Homer, Plato, and the Neoplatonist philosophers who saw the old gods not as petty, squabbling deities, but as manifestations of a single, divine, unknowable one. For Julian, this was not mythology, it was theology. It was philosophy. It was a vision of the cosmos that was beautiful, rational, and deeply Roman, compared to the squabbling, intolerant Christian sects he was forced to witness, who argued endlessly over the nature of Christ. Paganism seemed like a faith of intellectual freedom and profound tradition. He didn't just reject Christianity. He came to despise it as an irrational, upstart superstition, a Galilean madness that was poisoning the soul of Rome. For years, Julian kept his true faith a closely guarded secret. It was a death sentence. But fate had a strange turn in store for the bookish, secretive prince. His cousin, the Emperor Constantius, was a deeply insecure ruler. He had executed Julian's half-brother Gallus on suspicion of treason, and now he was alone, fighting wars on 2 fronts, against the Germans in the west and the Persians in the east. He needed a family member to represent him in Gaul, someone with the imperial name, but, he hoped, without any real ambition or ability. He chose Julian. In 355, the 24-year-old scholar was plucked from his studies in Athens, named Caesar, and sent to command the legions on the Rhine. It was meant to be a puppet role. Constantius likely expected him to fail, to be a mere figurehead while the generals did the real work. The emperor underestimated his cousin. Spectacularly, Julian the philosopher proved to be a natural soldier. He lived like his men, marching on foot, eating their same simple rations, and sleeping on the hard ground. He was disciplined, brilliant, and personally brave, leading his troops from the front. And he won. He drove the Germanic tribes back across the Rhine in a series of stunning victories, culminating in the Battle of Strasbourg, where his 13,000 Romans crushed a force nearly 3 times their size. He became a hero to his soldiers. He was the living embodiment of the old Roman virtues, a philosopher king in the mold of Marcus Aurelius. Back in the East, Constantius heard of Julian's victories not with pride, but with growing fear. This quiet cousin was becoming far too popular. In 360, Constantius made his move. He ordered Julian to send his best legions east for the Persian campaign. It was a transparent ploy to strip Julian of his power base, but it backfired. Julian's soldiers, the men who had fought and bled with him in Gaul, refused. They had no loyalty to a distant emperor they had never seen. Their loyalty was to the Caesar who had led them to glory. In the streets of Paris, they surrounded Julian's palace, chanting his name, and proclaimed him Augustus, full emperor of Rome. Julian was now at a crossroads. He could refuse and likely be killed, or he could accept and plunge the empire into a devastating civil war against his own cousin. He hesitated, but then he claimed, the genius of Rome itself appeared to him in a dream, urging him to save the state. He accepted. The civil war was on. The philosopher was now a rebel, marching his legions toward Constantinople. The epic confrontation between the pagan champion and the Christian emperor, however, would never happen. As Julian marched east, fate intervened. Constantius II, rushing to meet him, fell ill with a fever and died. And in a final shocking twist, the dying Christian emperor named his pagan rebel cousin as his rightful successor. In 361, Julian entered Constantinople not as a conqueror, but as the undisputed sole ruler of the Roman world. And the mask finally came off. He publicly declared his faith in the old gods. He performed sacrifices, restored temples, and invited the exiled pagan philosophers back to court. The Christian establishment was horrified. The man they had carefully raised in their faith, the last male heir of Constantine's dynasty, was an apostate. The apostate, they called him, a name that would stick for all of history. But Julian was no brutish persecutor. He was far too intelligent for that. He had spent years studying Christianity, and he understood its strengths better than most Christians did. He saw its tight-knit organization, its powerful bishops, its appeal to the poor through charity, and its unshakable belief in its own exclusive truth. He knew he couldn't just smash it with force. Diocletian had tried that and failed. Julian's plan was far more subtle and far more dangerous. He would not destroy Christianity. He would replace it. He set about trying to build a pagan church. He wanted to create a structured, organized pagan clergy, with a hierarchy of priests and high priests to rival the Christian bishops. He wrote letters to them, instructing them to live moral, upright lives, to study philosophy, and to be examples to their communities. He understood that for a religion to survive, it needed more than just rituals. It needed a moral core. Next, he attacked Christianity's greatest strength, its charity. Julian was furious that pagan priests were not caring for the poor, while the impious Galileans, as he called them, were supporting not only their own poor, but the pagan poor as well. He ordered the pagan high priests to establish food banks and shelters, funded by the state and private donations. He wanted to create a pagan system of social welfare that would make the Christian version irrelevant. He was trying to out-Christian the Christians. But his most brilliant and controversial move was aimed at the mind. In 362, he issued an edict on education. It forbade Christians from teaching the classical literature of Greece and Rome. His logic was devastatingly clever. How, he argued, could a man teach Homer if he did not worship Homer's gods? How could he explain the virtues of Jupiter if he believed Jupiter was a demon? It was intellectual and spiritual hypocrisy. He declared that if Christians wanted to teach, they should go to their churches and teach Matthew and Luke. The classics, the very heart of Roman and Greek identity, belonged to those who still honored the gods who filled their pages. This was a masterstroke. It was an attempt to cut Christianity off from the mainstream of intellectual life, to relegate it to a lowbrow, uncultured faith, while re-establishing paganism as the religion of education, culture, and true Romanitas. It was a declaration that to be truly educated and truly Roman, you had to be pagan. Julian was fighting a war on every front: theological, social, and intellectual. It was the most sophisticated, deliberate, and dangerous challenge the Christian Church had ever faced. It didn't come from an outside persecutor, but from the emperor himself, a brilliant man who knew his enemy inside and out. He was trying to reverse the tide of history with nothing but his own will and the power of the state. But the tide was strong, and the Christian Church, now embedded in the empire for 2 generations, was not going to give up its position without a fight. The question was, could one man, no matter how brilliant, truly resurrect the gods? To secure his revolution, Julian knew he needed more than just reforms. He needed a sign, a divine mandate. He needed a glorious military victory, one to rival Constantine's at the Milvian Bridge, a victory that would prove once and for all that the old gods were once again on Rome's side. And so he turned his eyes to the east, to the ancient enemy, Persia. He would gamble everything on one last great campaign. He assembled the largest Roman army seen in a generation. 65,000 of the empire's finest soldiers, the hardened veterans of the Rhine and the Danube, gathered under the eagle's standards. This was more than a campaign, it was a crusade. A pagan crusade. Every legion was accompanied by its priests, its soothsayers, its sacrificial animals. Julian, acting as Pontifex Maximus, personally oversaw the rituals, reading the omens in the steaming entrails of bulls, seeking the favor of Mars and Jupiter for the war to come. He was not just a general. He was the high priest of a revived faith, and this expedition would be its ultimate validation. Victory over Persia, the eternal enemy, would prove to the world that the old gods, the gods who had built Rome, were once again smiling upon their empire. The army marched east, a river of steel and leather flowing across the plains of Syria. And as they marched, Julian waged a second war. A war for the soul of his own empire. At every city, he was greeted as a liberator by the pagans. He reopened temples that had been shuttered for decades, their altars cold and their statues gathering dust. He funded their restoration from his own treasury, led the processions, and offered the sacrifices himself. He was a whirlwind of pagan energy, a philosopher in imperial purple, debating with local priests and scholars, trying to reshape paganism into a unified, coherent faith that could compete with the organizational power of the Christian Church. But he could feel the resistance. The Christians in his army, and there were many, watched his rituals with a quiet, sullen disapproval. His own Praetorian prefect, a man named Seleucus, warned him against the expedition, citing unfavorable omens. But Julian, filled with a burning certainty, dismissed them. He saw himself as a new Alexander the Great, a philosopher king destined to conquer the East and usher in a new golden age for Rome and its ancient gods. He was convinced of his own destiny, and nothing would stand in his way. In the spring of 363, the invasion began. Julian's strategy was brilliant. He split his forces, sending a detachment north to draw the Persian army away while he led the main force down the Euphrates River on a fleet of over 1,000 ships. The initial stages were a stunning success. The Romans smashed through the Persian border defenses. City after city fell before them. They were an unstoppable force, and it seemed Julian's gamble was paying off. The gods, it appeared, were with him. His soldiers, buoyed by victory and plunder, began to believe. Perhaps this strange, bookish emperor was truly favored by the divine. They pushed deeper and deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire, until they stood before the towering walls of Ctesiphon, the Persian capital. Victory was within their grasp. The city was the ultimate prize. Its capture would shatter the Persian Empire and cement Julian's legacy for all time. His generals urged him to begin the siege. And then, Julian made a decision that has baffled historians for centuries. He looked at the walls of the world's most heavily fortified city, and he looked at his victorious army, and he decided against a siege. He believed a long, drawn-out assault would weaken his men. He wanted a final, decisive battle in the open field. a glorious clash of arms that would annihilate the Persian army and its king, Shapur II, in a single stroke. He wanted an Alexander-style victory, total and absolute. To force this outcome, he made a catastrophic move. To remove any possibility of retreat, to commit his men completely to the path forward, he gave the order to burn his own fleet. The 1,000 ships that had carried their supplies, their siege engines, their path home all went up in flames. It was the ultimate gamble, a move of breathtaking audacity or breathtaking foolishness. Now there was no turning back. They would either conquer Persia or die in its heartland. At first, the Persians seemed to be in full retreat, luring the Romans further and further away from the river, deeper into the arid plains. But it was a trap. Shapur was no fool. He was a master of guerrilla warfare. As the Romans marched, they found the land had been burned. The wells were poisoned, the fields torched, the granaries emptied. The supplies Julian had hoped to capture were gone. The Persian army refused to give him the open battle he craved, instead harassing his columns with lightning-fast cavalry raids, picking off stragglers, and then melting back into the desert heat. The Roman army, the most powerful military machine in the world, was now starving. The mood of the soldiers turned from triumphant to desperate. The Mesopotamian sun beat down relentlessly. Thirst and hunger became their new enemies, more dangerous than any Persian spear. The men began to murmur. The gods that Julian had promised would protect them seemed to have abandoned them in this desolate wasteland. The Christians in the ranks saw it as God's judgment upon the apostate emperor who had forsaken Christ. On June 26, 363, the Persian cavalry launched another surprise attack, this time on the Roman rearguard. Julian, who was at the front of the column, heard the commotion. Without even stopping to put on his breastplate, he grabbed a shield and spurred his horse into the thick of the fighting. He was every inch the soldier emperor, fearless, leading from the front, rallying his men with his own personal courage. He plunged into the chaos of swirling dust and clashing steel, a whirlwind of imperial fury. His guards struggled to keep up. For a moment, the Roman line held, inspired by their emperor's presence. They began to push the Persians back. It was in this moment of seeming victory that a lone spear, thrown from the anonymous chaos of the melee, found its mark. It pierced Julian's side, embedding itself deep in his liver. He tried to pull it out himself, but the razor-sharp edges of the blade sliced his fingers to the bone. He slumped from his horse, falling into the arms of his companions. They carried him back to his tent, bleeding profusely. The army's physicians knew at once the wound was mortal. As his life ebbed away, Julian faced death not with fear, but with the calm composure of the philosopher he had always been. He spoke to the scholars and friends gathered around him, not of battle or empire, but of the noble nature of the soul, like Socrates in his final hours. He expressed his contentment that he was dying an honorable death, on the field of battle, and that the gods had chosen a clean end for him, sparing him from slow disease, conspiracy, or the tyranny of old age. His Christian enemies would later invent a more dramatic story. They claimed his final defiant words, uttered as he pulled the spear from his side and cast his own blood towards the heavens, were Vicisti Galilee. You have conquered, Galilean. It's almost certainly a fabrication, but it's a legend that reveals a deeper truth. Because in that moment the Galilean had conquered. Julian the Apostate, the last pagan emperor, the great hope for the restoration of the old ways, was dead. His death threw the army into chaos. Leaderless, starving, and trapped deep in enemy territory, the generals gathered in a desperate council of war. They needed an emperor, and they needed one now. Their choice fell upon a man named Jovian. He was a senior officer, a commander of the imperial guard, and he was a Christian. In the ultimate irony, the army that had marched to restore paganism was now commanded by a follower of Christ. Jovian's first act as emperor was not to fight, but to save his men. He began a humiliating retreat and negotiated a peace treaty with the Persians. The terms were disastrous. Rome was forced to surrender 5 provinces, key strategic fortresses, and abandon its longtime ally Armenia to Persian influence. It was one of the most shameful treaties in Roman history. The Grand Crusade had ended in utter catastrophe. The news of Julian's death and the subsequent defeat spread like wildfire across the empire. For the pagans, it was an unimaginable tragedy. Their champion, their philosopher king, was gone. The divine favor he had seemed to possess had vanished in a puff of desert dust. Their brief, brilliant renaissance was over before it had even truly begun. For the Christians, it was a miracle. It was divine retribution. God himself had struck down the apostate emperor and punished the arrogance of Rome. Julian's death wasn't just a military defeat, it was a theological verdict. The God of the Christians had proven, once and for all, that he was stronger than Jupiter, Mars, and the entire Roman pantheon combined. The path was now clear. The last great obstacle to a fully Christian empire had been removed, not by a Christian army, but by a Persian spear in a forgotten corner of the world. The pagan revival was dead, and with it, the last real chance for the old gods to survive. The death of an emperor on a distant battlefield had done what decades of debate and persecution could not. It had broken the back of the old religion. With Julian gone, the momentum was gone. The intellectual and political energy he had injected into the pagan cause evaporated under the Mesopotamian sun. His successor, a Christian officer named Jovian, was chosen by the demoralized army on the spot. His first acts were to sue for a humiliating peace with Persia and, crucially, to immediately restore the privileges of the Christian Church. The labarum, the Christian standard Julian had discarded, was once again hoisted above the legions. The stipends for the clergy were reinstated. The brief, brilliant pagan restoration was over as quickly as it had begun. Jovian's reign was short, a mere 8 months, but it was decisive. He had slammed the door shut. The emperors who followed, the brothers Valentinian and Valens, were a different breed from the Constantinian dynasty. They were rough, professional soldiers from the provinces, pragmatic and brutal. They were also Christians. But they weren't, at first, aggressive persecutors of paganism. Their primary concerns were securing the borders and putting down revolts, not hunting down the last worshippers of Jupiter. Valentinian, ruling in the West, even issued edicts of religious tolerance. He seemed to believe that the old faith was a dying thing, best left to wither on the vine rather than be martyred into a second life. He outlawed private, nocturnal sacrifices, which were associated with magic and treason, but public, traditional ceremonies were largely left alone. It was a policy of managed decline, a slow bureaucratic strangulation rather than a swift execution. The great pagan senatorial families in Rome could breathe, for a moment. They could continue their rites, hold their ancient priesthoods, and pretend that the world wasn't changing beneath their feet. But it was a fragile peace. The state was no longer their ally. It was at best a neutral observer and at worst a silent enemy. The imperial treasury no longer funded their temples or their ceremonies. The priesthoods that had once been the pinnacle of a Roman political career were now just titles, hollowed out and disconnected from the real levers of power. The energy was elsewhere. It was in the basilicas, in the bishops' courts, in the fierce theological debates that were now shaping imperial policy. Paganism was becoming a relic in its own lifetime. The turning point, the moment the Cold War turned hot, came with the next generation. Valentinian's son, Gratian, became emperor in the West. He was young, impressionable, and deeply influenced by one of the most formidable figures of the age, Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. Ambrose was no quiet theologian. He was a political powerhouse, a former provincial governor who understood power and how to wield it. He saw no room for compromise. To him, the Roman state's lingering connection to paganism wasn't just an anachronism. It was a sin, an offense to God that invited divine punishment. And he had the emperor's ear. In 382 AD, Gratian, under Ambrose's guidance, took a momentous step. He ordered the altar of victory removed from the Senate house in Rome. This wasn't just a piece of furniture. The altar of victory was a powerful symbol. It had stood in the Curia for centuries. On it, senators had sworn oaths to the emperor and to Rome. It represented the divine protection that had guided the city from a small village to a world-spanning empire. To remove it was to sever the final link between the Roman state and its ancestral gods. The pagan senators were horrified. They dispatched their most eloquent speaker, Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, to plead their case before the emperor. His speech is a masterpiece of rhetoric, a moving, desperate defense of a dying world. He didn't argue for the truth of the old gods against the Christian one. He argued for tradition, for heritage, for the soul of Rome itself. "We ask for peace for the gods of our fathers, the gods of our homeland," he pleaded. He appealed to the mystery of the divine, saying, What does it matter by which path each seeks the truth? We cannot attain to so great a secret by one road alone. It was a call for pluralism, for respecting the customs that had made Rome great. But Ambrose would have none of it. He fired back with a letter of his own, full of the unshakable certainty of the new faith. He ridiculed the idea of a state funding error. He asked, "Why should I pay for honors I do not believe in?" He reminded Gratian that his duty was to God, not to the traditions of idolaters. The argument was no longer about philosophy, it was about power and salvation. And in this new Roman world, Ambrose's argument was the only one that mattered. The altar of victory was removed. Gratian also renounced the ancient title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman religion, a title held by every emperor since Augustus, including Constantine. The state was now officially, symbolically, and financially divorced from its pagan past. The final, decisive blows came under the man who would earn the title the Great, Theodosius, a Spanish general who became emperor in the East and eventually ruler of the entire empire. Theodosius was a pious, iron-willed Nicene Christian. For him, there was no room for debate, no space for Symmachus's different paths. There was one truth, one empire, and one God. Starting in 391 AD, he issued a series of decrees that effectively outlawed paganism entirely. These weren't just restrictions, they were a death sentence. All sacrifices, public or private, were forbidden under penalty of death. All temples were to be closed. Entering a temple for the purpose of worship became a crime. The state subsidies that had kept the last few temple cults alive were permanently cut. The eternal flame of Vesta, which had burned in the heart of Rome for over 1100 years, tended by the sacred Vestal Virgins, was extinguished. The institution of the Vestals was disbanded. The Delphic oracle fell silent. The Olympic Games, celebrated for over 1,000 years in honor of Zeus, were held for the last time in 393 AD, and then banned as a pagan festival. This was the end, not a slow fade, but a legislative execution. But the old world would not go down without one last fight. In 392 AD, the Western Emperor was murdered, and a pagan rhetorician named Eugenius was put on the throne by a powerful Frankish general named Arbogast. It was a pagan coup. They marched into Italy, restored the altar of victory to the Senate, and reopened the temples. For a brief, defiant moment, the smoke of sacrifice once again rose over the city of Rome. It was a final, desperate gamble, a last stand for the old gods. Theodosius marched west with his army to meet them. The two forces clashed in 394 AD at the Battle of the Frigidus River, in modern-day Slovenia. This wasn't just a battle for control of the empire. It was seen by both sides as a holy war, a final judgment. Eugenius's forces fought under the banner of Hercules. Theodosius's army fought under the Christian Labarum. On the second day of the battle, a freakishly powerful wind, a local phenomenon known as the bora, kicked up, blowing dust and grit directly into the faces of the pagan army, throwing their lines into chaos and blunting the force of their arrows. Theodosius's troops saw it as a miracle, a divine wind sent by the Christian god to smite his enemies. They charged, and the pagan army broke. Eugenius was captured and executed. Arbogast fell on his own sword. The victory was absolute. The last pagan army was shattered. The last pagan emperor was dead. Theodosius had not just defeated a usurper. He had, in the eyes of the Christian world, proven that their God was the true master of the Roman battlefield, the true arbiter of its destiny. The gods of Olympus had been given one last chance to defend their worshippers, and they had failed. The war was over. Christianity had won. The Arian heresy was crushed. The pagan revival was shattered. Theodosius the Great now stood as the sole, undisputed master of the Roman world, and his God was the God of the empire. There would be no more compromises, no more turning a blind eye to the old ways. The long, slow twilight of the gods had ended. Now came the final starless night. In the years that followed, a series of laws known as the Theodosian decrees were unleashed. They were not suggestions. They were a legal sledgehammer designed to systematically dismantle the entire superstructure of pagan belief. Sacrifice, whether public or private, was now high treason, punishable by death. Entering a temple for any reason other than to admire it as a work of art was a crime. Even the simple, private act of honoring one's household gods, the Lares and Penates, with a pinch of incense or a garland of flowers was now illegal. your property forfeit to the state. Imagine the psychological shock. For over 1,000 years, these rituals had been the bedrock of Roman identity, the sacred contract between the people and the divine that ensured prosperity and protection. Now, the state itself declared that contract null and void. It declared its own ancestors to be criminals. In 394 AD, the order was given. The sacred flame of Vesta, which had burned uninterrupted in the heart of Rome for over 1,100 years, was extinguished. The Vestal Virgins, the keepers of Rome's spiritual heart, were disbanded. It was a gesture of breathtaking finality. It was like pulling the plug on the empire's life support. That same year, the Olympic Games, celebrated for a millennium in honor of Zeus, were held for the very last time, then banned forever as a pagan festival. One by one, the ancient foundational pillars of Greco-Roman culture were kicked out. But you can't just erase a belief system that has saturated every aspect of life for centuries. The transition was messy, complex, and deeply human. In the countryside, away from the emperor's gaze, the old ways persisted. Farmers still whispered prayers to Ceres for a good harvest and left offerings for the spirits of the woods. But even here, Christianity adapted with shrewd brilliance. It didn't just destroy, it absorbed. It engaged in a process we now call syncretism. The Church, seeing the deep-rooted power of these traditions, began to co-opt them. Did a village have a local goddess of the spring? Soon, that spring was rededicated to the Virgin Mary. Was there a heroic local pagan figure? He might be subtly transformed into a Christian saint, his feast day conveniently aligning with the old festival. The greatest of these appropriations was Christmas itself. The 25th of December was the great Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, celebrating the rebirth of the light after the winter solstice. The Church, recognizing it could never stamp out such a popular celebration, simply placed the birth of its own Savior, the light of the world, directly on top of it. Saturnalia, the wild, gift-giving festival in late December, saw its traditions of feasting and generosity folded into the new Christian holiday. It was a hostile takeover on a cultural level. The gods weren't just being defeated, their very identities, their rituals, their holy days were being hollowed out and repurposed for their conqueror. While this subtle assimilation was happening, a far more violent process was also underway. Emboldened by the emperor's laws, mobs of fanatical monks and Christian zealots, who saw themselves as soldiers of God, began to take matters into their own hands. They swept through the countryside and into the cities, armed with clubs and torches, convinced they were cleansing the land of demonic influence. They didn't just close temples, they demolished them. They smashed priceless statues, defaced sacred art, and burned libraries filled with centuries of pagan philosophy and literature. The most famous act of destruction took place in Alexandria, the intellectual heart of the ancient world. Here stood the magnificent Serapeum, a temple to the god Serapis so grand it was said to rival the Capitol in Rome. In 391 AD, the Christian patriarch of the city, at the head of an enormous mob, laid siege to the temple. The remaining pagan worshippers barricaded themselves inside, terrified. There was a prophecy that if the colossal statue of Serapis within were ever harmed, the sky would fall and the world would dissolve into chaos. For days, a tense standoff ensued. Finally, the Roman soldiers broke down the doors. A soldier was ordered to strike the first blow. He lifted his axe, and with all of Alexandria holding its breath, he swung it into the knee of the god. The crowd gasped, and then nothing. The sky did not fall. The earth did not crack open. He swung again and again, until the head of the god was severed and dragged through the streets as a trophy. That moment was a profound psychological turning point. The gods were not just silent, they were powerless to defend their own holiest shrines. They were just stone and plaster. For countless people on the fence, this was the final devastating proof. The old gods were dead. The final battlefield, however, was not stone but ideas. In 410 AD, a catastrophe occurred. Rome, the eternal city, was sacked by the Visigoths. For the first time in 800 years, foreign invaders breached the walls. The pagan aristocrats who remained saw their chance. "This is what happens," they cried. "We abandoned the gods who made Rome great, and now they have abandoned us. This Christian God is a failure." It was a powerful argument, and it shook the Christian world. The response came from a brilliant North African bishop, Augustine of Hippo. He wrote a monumental work, The City of God, that would become a cornerstone of Western thought. In it, he systematically dismantled the pagan argument. He argued that Rome had suffered countless disasters, plagues, and defeats long before Christ was ever born. The worship of Jupiter and Juno had not saved it from the Gauls, or from devastating civil wars. But Augustine's true genius was to reframe the entire concept of history. Rome, he argued, was merely the city of man, an earthly, imperfect kingdom, destined to rise and fall like all things made by human hands. Its fate was irrelevant. What truly mattered was the city of God, the eternal spiritual community of believers. The sacking of earthly Rome was a tragedy, yes, but it had no bearing on the salvation of the soul or the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. This was the final intellectual divorce. Augustine severed the 1,000-year-old link between the fate of the Roman Empire and the worship of its traditional gods. He gave Christians a new narrative, a way to understand the chaos of their collapsing world, not as a sign of God's weakness, but as a necessary part of his divine plan. And so the fall was complete. It wasn't one thing but everything. It was the social decay that made a message of hope and equality appealing. It was the political genius of Constantine, who saw in the cross a symbol to unite an empire. It was the legal force of Theodosius, who outlawed the competition. It was the clever syncretism that absorbed and replaced old traditions, and the violent fanaticism that tore down what it couldn't convert. And it was the intellectual revolution of thinkers like Augustine, who gave people a new way to see the world. The gods of Olympus didn't die in a blaze of glory. They weren't struck down from the heavens by a rival deity. They faded. They were starved of sacrifice, their temples fell into ruin, their stories were overwritten, and their followers over generations simply forgot them. They became myths, statues in a museum, characters in a story, silent stone relics of a world that was gone forever, their whispers drowned out by the prayers to a new god who had conquered not just an empire, but the human soul itself, and in doing so had laid the foundation for the next 2,000 years of Western civilization.